Today, as promised, is Hire for Growth. And it's one of the three core pillars of developing what we refer to as our new growth curve. We will be talking a little bit about the new growth curve as we go through the program today. Many years ago, we developed a cost of shadows calculator. And the calculator is a great way for us to, I think, frame the challenge that's in front of us, the challenge of hiring effective salespeople. Many of us as hiring managers, and I know that we have some folks here in HR roles, as well as hiring managers, as well as some CEOs. Many of us look first to the individual we hire, and they can become the source or the object of our disappointment and frustration because we hire them and they don't perform as planned. Well, what I'm going to do is try to create some objectivity around this conversation to frame the problem that we face. And this is our cost of shadows calculator. What we think of when we think of a shadow is a place where someone can hide. And what we strive to do in a sales organization is eliminate the shadows, right? We want to illuminate every corner of our organization so there's nowhere for someone to hide. And that really comes from the manager providing an absolute level of accountability. People who hide in the shadows, we refer to as shadow people. Now, sometimes folks we hire prefer to live in the shadows, and sometimes they just rest there because the manager isn't really expecting any level of accountability. Either way, we want to eliminate those shadows, and we want to identify when our hiring process is subjecting us to those shadow people. The point here is to figure out what does it really cost us to field a team, and how are we doing over, in this case, the last 5 years. And this was done with an organization that had they averaged somewhere between 7 and 12 salespeople at any one point in time, depending upon their goals and depending upon what the market would bear. We're looking to identify how many of those people that we hired would we say were performers. Now, this is where you can modify the calculator with your definition of what a performer is. We tend to think of a performer as someone who's hitting at least 90% of their number or their quota for 2 of the last 3 years on average. In this case, about half of those folks that were hired were underperformers, what we call shadow people. So the question here is, what was the cost of bringing those folks on board? And for many hiring managers, this is a wonderful calculation because it will help give them the ability to communicate up the organization to suggest, look, we've got to make a change. The process we're executing today isn't good enough. I love giving this calculator to CFOs and other financial types because it's a real bulletproof calculation, and it's one that gains a lot of credibility when a chief financial officer or a financial member of the team fills it out. So what was the total cost to recruit and hire those folks? We look at recruiting fees, so advertising fees, et cetera. I chose a small number. This might be an advertising budget for a few months to keep the numbers realistic. Average number of candidates screened and interviewed for each sales position. You typically want to screen and interview a large number for every person you hire. This is a relatively modest number. How many hours of time, et cetera. So we're looking at the total cost of recruiting those folks. Then we're looking at total payroll costs of having them on the team. In this case, the team members were earning about $72,000 a year as a base, not including commission. And these shadow people were working with us on average for about 20 months. So we want to look at how long those 11 folks worked with us, find the average and plug that in. And then there's this total cost to manage and develop our shadow people. So the manager's time invested each month to lead and develop. So we're thinking about developmental work and maybe some investment in training. Every organization is different in this regard. Many organizations invest very heavily in onboarding and training because their products are very technical. You'll want to account for that here. What's the total opportunity cost? This is really the big number here, right? So we're looking at not only the amount of time that the position was vacant as we recruited and then ramped up and onboarded the new hire. We're also looking at the difference between what a performer and a non-performer delivers to the organization in terms of margin. And then we add everything together and we identify the cost of all 11 of those shadow people, but also the average cost per hire. The reason I suggest that you think about the challenge this way is because too often, the way we think of salespeople, it becomes a transactional endeavor to hire and bring someone on. And then we make ourselves feel better by saying, look, if they don't work out, we'll just replace them. Now, from my perspective as a salesperson, having spent 15 years in the field, and as somebody who was hiring salespeople, I felt obligated to ensure that when I took someone out of the employment pool or out of a job and brought them to my organization, I wanted to make sure that they were a good fit. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing everything I could to make them successful. So I, as a hiring manager, always felt an obligation to make a good hire. And I never felt comfortable saying, look, if they don't work out, we'll just replace them. How do we solve the problem? So I had mentioned to you that hiring for growth is one of 3 pillars that we identify as part of our new growth curve. What we had the opportunity to do was look at our clients over several years, and we tracked more than 10,000 working sessions between us and the different members of our team and the partners we work with. And we identified 3 stages of predictable growth. And this was across over 100 industries. So this is fairly diversified data set. And we identified 1 growth curve and 3 components. It's really interesting to note that the clients that were the most successful with us achieved an exponential level of growth upon starting with us. That growth continued but leveled off midway through. And then toward the end of the relationship began to create that hockey stick. And we were curious as to why. What causes that incremental or exponential growth in the beginning is this idea of really formalizing our operating structure. What does this have to do with hiring people? You can't know who to hire unless you really have a really well-formed operating structure and you know how your sales team's going to operate. You want to ultimately hire people who are going to fit the organization. For sales organizations that have a random approach to leading their team, or a process that really isn't well maintained and well managed to, you create lots of room for people to come in and do whatever they want. There's not a lot of discipline. There's not a lot of identifiable best practices, and people end up doing what they want to do. And the manager ends up having very little control in terms of knowing that everyone is doing the very best they can to be successful. We can't know that if there isn't a single reference point that we have to train people to and develop people to. So the operating structure is a critical component of what we call the lead stage. This is where leadership takes over and establishes the operating structure. Clients that we brought on board that stopped working with us here, many of those organizations just naturally moved back to their natural point of equilibrium, right? When we go through change, that change is uncomfortable. Unless it's sustained somehow, we end up going back to where we were. I know this personally because having grown up in the restaurant business, I struggled with weight my whole life. You know, we all have our challenges, but for me, it was always the yo-yo, right? I would get healthy where I wanted to be, and then I would just kind of cheat here and there and end up back to where I started, my equilibrium, where I felt most comfortable. So I was able to understand that and think about how I could stop that from happening, how I could reset my equilibrium. And what's really important is at this leverage stage that organizations think about taking that operating structure and doing some team development in order to support that investment that they made earlier. And this is really where leverage occurs. When we create the team, we create leverage across the team that really gives us the sustainability in the organization, but also continues to create that growth. Now, of course, we have the opportunity to move back to equilibrium here as well. What stops that from happening is the fact that we are now positioned to make scalable investments. And the icon here has a number of people associated with it because the principal investment we're talking about is our investment in people. Once you build an operating structure and you support that operating structure by developing your team and creating leverage among the team, you continue the growth by bringing people into the organization that are a natural fit for the organization that you have created. When we hire for growth, we're actually hiring for leverage. We're hiring that person who can join the team and contribute to the team's operating leverage. And when we can create that leverage, we can create that multiplier effect within our organization. So we've established the problem that we're facing. Hiring incorrectly is very costly, even though we may not see it. It's kind of like the frog in the warm water. As the water gets warmer, the frog doesn't realize it and then faces a disaster. Oftentimes when we're operating and managing a team, we don't really notice the costs that we're incurring by the decisions that we're making. Next, we talked about this idea of building out a foundational structure that will tell us exactly who we should be hiring. So let's think about making a scalable investment or a wise and predictable investment in an individual. The way that we maintain the alignment of that individual with the team that we've built to create maximum leverage for that investment is we want to make sure that that individual is an ideal fit for the role that they're going to play on the team that they're going to be part of. So when we're going out to hire, we're thinking about the role we want to fit. We're thinking about the seat they're going to occupy on that team. And we're also looking to make sure that the combination of the player and the seat is an ideal fit to the goal that we have set for the organization and the goal that the organization or the operating structure is designed to deliver. So what's really interesting about looking at the world this way is that whenever you have the chance to go out and hire either someone to replace an individual on the team or someone who's going to be additive to the team, to expand the team, you also have an opportunity to test the alignment that exists within this team. How often do we write a job description or define a job role, and then we, over time, allow that role to evolve? We allow the role definition to change. And then over time, that becomes the norm. It works, it becomes the norm, but we don't go back and adjust the role. We don't go back and think about where that role fits within the larger team and the larger organization. And what ends up happening is, over time, that level of evolution creates a lack of alignment in the organization. The alignment we started with now is getting weaker and weaker, and therefore it's getting harder and harder for us to hire for growth because we're hiring for a moving target, a target that we haven't defined effectively. So this is the picture you want to have in mind. Once you build the organization effectively from left to right, you then maintain the organization and generate lift by the practical operation and the practical hiring process that moves from right to left. So let's talk about fit to role. And you can see very first here on the list is this idea of a role and compensation analysis. So we want to make sure that the role we're hiring to is well defined. And of course, this gives us the chance to define the role, make sure it's a proper fit among all the other roles that make up our team, and then of course, check the alignment or fit to goal back to the operating structure. That is the first chance that we have. HR, for example, or a personnel or the recruiting group would get together with the hiring manager and make sure that this alignment still exists. What we're doing here is now we are defining and testing the target. What are we aiming for? We want to have that target defined. Now we're going to identify ideal candidate, and that comes with the definition of the job and the ad you might create, the high impact sourcing strategy. When we think about sourcing, we think about casting a wide net across a diverse number of outlets and sources. This is very important. We want a high number of candidates, not a low number that we feel like we can manage, but a very high number. Let's fill the pipeline and then think about how we can manage that pipeline more easily. Just like the sales pipeline, it's going to make sure that you're not making decisions about bringing people or qualifying people into the process that shouldn't be there because you feel like you don't have enough choices. The big tool that we use to help manage that pipeline is our validated and predictive fit assessments and tools. So one of the things that we've developed over the years is this ability to create candidates. And then before we even evaluate a resume or an application, we assess the candidate, leveraging our growth multiplier index, which I will share with you in a moment. It's a tool that we use to actually reduce the role definition that we're trying to fill to about 150 data points that create a validated model for the role. And once we have those 150 data points, that profile for the role, we can then go out and evaluate people for a fit to that role. It's marvelous. It works really well. We are identifying the performance mindset of the person or the natural work style of that person and evaluating their fit to the requirements of the role. What's important about this idea of natural work style is that we know that the more natural the fit, the higher the motivation, right? The more enthusiastic somebody is to go to work. The more enthusiastic they are, the more dedicated they are to preparing themselves for success. The higher the motivation and the higher the preparation, the more consistent the execution. When you have somebody who's a natural fit for the role, the manager's job becomes that much easier. As a manager, I'm not now chasing people to do things that they don't want to do. I don't have to invest time doing that. I've hired someone who is a fit for the requirements of the role. So if the role requires work that most people don't like doing, and this person is a natural for those kinds of tasks, I'm not going to have to worry about chasing them to make sure it happens. I'm not going to have to fight with them over goal achievement. I'm not going to have to micromanage their time. Life becomes really good. And what's really cool about this is the employee ramps up much quicker. When we conduct our recruiting this way, and we leverage the growth multiplier index, we're able to initiate about a 6 to 8 week validation period after someone is hired. Imagine that. Imagine knowing within 6 or 8 weeks whether someone's going to be successful versus waiting the 6 months to 2 years that most sales organizations have to wait. You're saving all that salary, you're saving all that wasted opportunity, all those major costs that went into the cost of shadows calculator we went through earlier. Why do we need the 6 week to 8 week period? Well, there is no such thing as a perfect candidate. There's no such thing as a perfect system. What we're doing here is creating directional alignment, right? Sales is a game of probability, not a game of perfection. Same thing with hiring. So what we're looking for is a high probability fit. We're not considering what it's like now to drive to work, what it's like to interact with other employees. There are a myriad of other variables that we aren't assessing for that may be influencing someone's effectiveness and longevity. But what's great about this process is we're able to get rid of all the other variables that create challenges long term, and we can very effectively construct an onboarding and ramp up period along with a test or a validation at the end of the 6 weeks to make sure we hired the right person. And when we do this, we find that we're able to have a 90% success rate or higher, meaning 9 of 10 folks that exit the validation period become top performers in the first year that they're on the job. So they have longevity and they have high performance. Instead of going through the other 12 steps, I'm going to stop here and just share with you the impact of leveraging the growth multiplier index to validate the predictive fit of our candidates. The challenge that we have today that I'm trying to help us all think about is how do we enter 2021 with a higher level of confidence that we can adjust our sales organization to the new reality of that new year. What new reality? Well, if you have salespeople that are used to being on the road and working face-to-face, that's going to happen much less. That's probably the biggest reality because that changes the dominant skill set required to be successful on the sales team. And it's making that being effective in a virtual mode that much more important. And these skills are not transferable. What you're seeing here is our team success report. What you're looking at is a sales team. What we've done is we've identified 150 data points, all aggregated for each member of the sales team. And we now understand what quadrant within the matrix they operate in. Where is their natural work style? So as you can see here, Thomas J., for example, is an innovator. So Thomas, as a salesperson, is someone who loves to sell conceptual solutions. He likes to sell the vision. It's selling that doesn't require the constructs of a very firm product set. This person goes out and looks to create custom solutions for their customers. You can see that there's no one in the synthesizer quadrant, no one in the organization who is predisposed to naturally selling value. On the left-hand side are the members of the sales team that are more internally focused or product-centric, right? So the people who are focused on capabilities tend to only look at the rigid definition of the products and services that they sell. These are the folks that are more inclined to pitch versus to ask questions. These are the folks, and this is a very important point, when you send them through training, these are the folks that don't learn how to adapt and adopt a consultative way of selling. These are folks who just cannot seem to break out of that order taker mentality versus being an order maker. Now, the improver, who is also on the left-hand side and also internally centric, does have the ability to think in terms of solutions. What's the difference? Well, someone who thinks in terms of solutions thinks in terms of capabilities in the context of the client's world. So they will look to bring experiences that they have implementing, for example, and understanding how customers use their capabilities and craft solutions for those organizations. But they will still begin with the capabilities or products that they bring to the table or services they bring to the table. They still have an internal mindset. What's interesting about all these folks is they all have the same role. They all share the same role definition. You would expect there to be a level of specialization and maybe a tighter grouping of these folks around Thomas. But you have this diversity in these two areas. Why is that? We discovered that there isn't really just one role here. There are two roles, right? There are the folks in the vision quadrant who are responsible for new business and really gravitate there. And then there are folks who really get their business from doing account management work. So what this tells us is we have to think about maybe changing our role definitions. In other words, do we want every salesperson to have the opportunity to hunt, have the opportunity to farm, and have the opportunity to account manage, which is the situation today? Or do we create more specialization in the sales force and hire folks who are only responsible for hunting, hire folks who are only responsible for farming, and hire folks who are only responsible for account management? What's the impact? The higher the specialization, the more natural the fit, and the happier your sales team. The happier your sales team, the more motivated they are to come to work, the better prepared they are, right? The more they seek mastery in their role, and the higher the quality and activity in their execution. We've got some decisions to make with regard to this team. And the benefit of looking at your team in this way is to take a picture or a snapshot of where you are right now to understand how far away you may be from the ultimate objective, which is hiring for growth. Are you truly prepared to make the next hire one of your best hires? As I mentioned, I would love to offer each and every one of you the chance to experience the index yourself. Up to 10 folks, we're happy to create a team success report. We'll also give you some additional analysis that will actually score your team and give you a sense of how balanced it is. What we find statistically and what's been validated scientifically is that the more balance you have across your organization, the more resilient your organization, and the more likely your organization is to respond effectively to changes like the one that we experienced this year, but also changes like mergers and acquisitions, adding new products, going after new markets, all the typical adjustments that occur within an organization. How likely is your team to adjust to that? It's really going to be dictated by and predicated upon the level of balance that you've built into the team. The other nice thing about the GMI is that it can be leveraged across teams. It's not just a tool for the sales team. So if we have folks on the webinar today who have visibility across other organizations like leadership teams, how balanced is our leadership team? How balanced is our marketing team, our finance team, our IT group? The growth multiplier index will be effective across all those groups because it's not specialized for sales. It's leverageable by role. So whatever role we're evaluating, that's the role we can develop the fit for, regardless of where that role sits in the organization. And of course, you can leverage grow@florisgroup.com to find your way to me if you have any questions as you take the lead and take control of growth in your organization.